I still hear her laugh echoing off the pines. One moment it was warmth, the next it was venom. There was a night when the cabin's only light flickered out, and the truth slipped between us like smoke. I didn't know then that every whispered promise, every careful omission, was building toward my undoing. Now, I stand at the edge of that very woods, the weight of what I've planned pressing down like the chill before dawn. By the time you hear my confession, it will already be too late for her to see what comes next. My name is Lena, and I thought I knew the shape of our love as well as I knew my own reflection. You know, sometimes you think the ground beneath you is solid, like that ridge we hiked on, breathing high-altitude air, and you never suspect it's riddled with cracks. But, like, that night, I realized the earth could swallow you whole if you stop paying attention. I remember arriving at the cabin in the valley a few weeks ago, suitcase in one hand, my heart full of hopeful noise. It was our anniversary trip, just us, the towering pines, and the promise of a weekend without screens or calls or the usual grind. The kind of plan we'd both begged for. But when I opened the door, the silence felt wrong. Too deep, too waiting. You know that hush when someone holds their breath? That's how I felt, stepping inside. My hands trembled and I swallowed against the dryness in my throat. She was there, curled by the fireplace, flicking through an old photo album. Her name is Sarah. Her laugh used to dawn in my chest like warmth, but that night it was brittle as frost on glass. She looked up, eyes widening in a flash of guilt before she smiled, a smile that didn't make it to her eyes, like the moon hiding behind clouds. My jaw locked for a moment. I sensed the distance before I understood it. A few suspicious glances, a flicker of hesitation when she closed that album. I asked how her day went. She said fine, just fine. But her voice did that thing where it wavered at the edge, like she was ready to shatter into pieces. I laughed it off, tried to pull her close, but her body felt distant, as though she'd forgotten how to melt against me. The fire crackled. Outside, wind rattled the shutters. Inside, the air tasted of something unspoken. That first night, I dreamed of her whispering another name. I woke up with my sheets damp and my heart hammering. But I shook it off, told myself I was being silly. You know, denial is easy when love is involved. My hands, though, they shook every time she moved away from me, even a step. I caught myself watching her, heart in my throat, as if I could stare hard enough to see the truth. Over dinner, I noticed her glancing at her phone too often. Small things, a hidden text, a quick lock of the screen when I looked over. My pulse spiked, but I forced a smile. I joked about ordering dessert and leaned forward, trying to bridge that cold gap. But she said she wasn't hungry. She sipped her wine, lips pressed together, and for one beat, I saw panic flash across her eyes. Then she hid it. That night, I waited until she was asleep and searched her messages. My thumbs felt heavy, like wading through mud, but I scrolled. And there it was, a string of texts to someone whose name I didn't recognize, each one casual, intimate, marked by little hearts. My chest twisted. My breath became sharp, caught in my ribs. I shut the phone and held it to my chest like it was a beating heart, one that belonged to someone else. The next morning, I walked outside to where the mist curled around the pines. My hands were clammy, and my jaw was tight. I pictured her face, happy, loving, innocent. And I pictured her lying. The image cut through me like a blade. I felt rage rising, and beneath it, something darker, a resolve. I would make her understand that every lie she told me would have a price. That was the moment it began, when the silence first cracked. And from that crack, I vowed, would build my revenge stone by stone. From the moment I slipped back into the cabin and found her trembling by the hearth, clutching that recorder like a lifeline, I knew the real work was just beginning. I watched her shoulders quake, heard her ragged breaths fill the room, and felt a flicker of something I hadn't expected, almost like pity, but darker. Because pity is nothing but another kind of power, right? It was in that strange hush that I decided to push further, to watch her world tilt on its axis until her doubts consumed her as completely as her lies had consumed mine. I started with her routines. She drank chamomile tea every evening, always in that chipped mug with the hand-painted wildflowers. So I swapped it subtly for one stained with a reddish hue, diluted beet juice mixed with tea. It took me 2 tries to get the tint right, but that evening, when she lifted the mug to her lips and paused, her nose wrinkling, I saw panic flash. She set the cup down, fingertips brushing the rim as if it might bite. I didn't need to say anything. The next day, she spent hours Googling food poisoning symptoms on my laptop, her face ghost white when I walked into the study. She insisted she felt nauseous yesterday, that maybe she'd eaten something off. My chest tightened, but I kept my voice soft when I asked if she was okay. She nodded, swallowing hard, and I could almost taste her relief when I said it was probably nothing serious. Later, I rearranged a few items in the cabin, her favorite paperback buried under a pile of pillows, the family photo from our last vacation hidden in a drawer. Watching her search for them, growing more bewildered with each failed attempt, felt like watching someone wander through a maze with no exit signs. She groped at memories, at objects that used to anchor her, and found emptiness instead. Each small disappearance sharpened her unease. She began jittering at the slightest creak, the wind through the pine needles, her own footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. One afternoon, I invited her to join me upstairs, to look at sketches I'd been working on. She followed, wary but curious. When she stepped into my makeshift studio, I shut the door behind us and dimmed the lamp. On the drafting table lay a stack of printed screenshots, her messages to him, the stranger whose name I still didn't know. Beneath them, I'd placed the photo album she'd been flipping through on arrival, its flaps creased and worn. I watched her face as she processed the evidence, her lips parting, eyes glassy. "I thought you loved me," she whispered, voice cracking. My heart pounded, but I stayed calm, letting her feel every inch of betrayal I'd carried. I told her that love had nothing to do with secrets, that truth was the only knife both sharp and honest. She sank to her knees, her mouth quivering, and I stepped back, knowing I'd carved the first real wound into her soul. But I wasn't done. I needed her to unravel, piece by piece. So I began shifting our surroundings, removing the lock on the main door so it clicked open at night, leaving footprints in the snow outside the cabin to suggest someone else had been there, small things that whispered of intrusion. She started barricading windows, trembling as she tucked extra blankets around the frame, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting someone to emerge from the pines. Her eyes grew haunted, her voice hollow when she asked if I thought she was losing her mind. I told her gently that maybe the mountain air was playing tricks, murmurs of wind through empty rooms. Each morning I found her curled on the sofa, arms wrapped around herself, eyes unfocused. She confessed in hushed tones that she felt watched, that she couldn't sleep for the shadows dancing in the corners. My chest constricted, because I knew exactly what she saw, yet all I did was brush a lock of hair from her forehead and murmur reassurances I didn't believe. I leaned into the lie so thoroughly that even I started to doubt where my compassion ended and my cruelty began. One evening, as twilight bled through the windows, she pulled me into her arms and sobbed, "I'm so sorry for everything." Her words rattled me, because beneath them I heard a genuine sorrow, not just fear. And I realized then that revenge is less about justice and more about control, twisting someone's reality until they beg for the mercy they never offered you. I held her for a moment longer than she expected, feeling her sobs soften, then withdrew, leaving her standing alone in the dim room. I stepped outside into the crisp air and exhaled, watching the cabin glow like a lantern in the gathering dark. In that silence, I understood the shape of the next move. The hunt had become a ritual, each ritual a confession under the weight of her own guilt. And soon, I would force her to speak the one truth she'd never admit, that she had destroyed us both when she chose to lie. As I turned back toward the door, the wind carried a whisper through the pines, soft enough that I could have imagined it. But I knew what it meant. The next phase was waiting inside, where shadows grew long and secrets grew louder. The morning after I left her trembling by the hearth, the cabin felt impossibly still, like the world had paused to watch what would happen next. I found her on the sofa, pale and hollow-eyed, clutching the recorder as though it were the only proof she still owned. I knelt beside her, letting the hush stretch until it felt heavy, until her breath shuddered against the silence. Finally, she laid the device on the coffee table and looked at me, her eyes raw with fear and something else, like regret trying to claw its way out. I offered no comfort. Instead, I rose and went to the bookshelf, my fingers brushing the spines until I found what I was seeking. I lifted a battered journal, her private confessions, the pages filled with trembling loops of ink. There, halfway through, I discovered an entry I hadn't expected. In shaky handwriting, she'd written about me, about Lena's kindness, and how easy it was to lie. She described an ache that followed every unspoken truth, how her chest tightened until she thought it might break. I held the journal to my face, smelling the must of old paper and her hidden sorrow. Proof number 1, her own admission that guilt had haunted her even before I knew. Her words were a confession taped to the inside of her heart, and I read them aloud, voice soft, so that each syllable landed like a blow. Later, I slipped upstairs and searched her bedside table. Beneath a stack of paperback thrillers, I found a crumpled note folded so many times its creases cut into the paper. I smoothed it out. It was addressed to someone I didn't know, signed with a pet name I'd never heard. In that letter, she apologized for breaking promises, for needing something real, and begged for understanding. She'd promised to end it, she'd vowed to confess, but then she'd stayed silent. Proof number 2, her plea for forgiveness, written in the dead of night, never meant for my eyes. I pressed the note to my chest, my heartbeat hammering, and I let the weight of her betrayal settle in my bones. When I returned downstairs, she sat on the rug, knees drawn to her chest, eyes fixed on the fireplace embers. I placed the journal and the note in front of her without a word. Her jaw slackened, tears spilling over as she reached for the journal first, then the note. I watched her hands tremble as she read her own words, the same guilt I'd glimpsed mirrored in her shaking fingertips. Her body sagged, and she buried her face in her knees, muffling her sobs. It felt like watching a sculpture crumble, something beautiful reduced to dust. I crouched behind her and placed a hand on her shoulder, warm against her cold skin. My voice was quiet. You wrote these for someone else, but you lived them with me. She shuddered, tilting her head so I could see her eyes, glassy with tears. I'm so sorry, she whispered, voice so small it might have been imagined. But I tightened my grip, letting her feel the strength in my grip, the inevitability of what I'd set in motion. She looked up then, her lips quivering, and for the first time I saw her truly, vulnerable, shattered, and full of regret. It made something in my chest twist. Part of me ached to pull her into my arms and forgive everything, but the rest of me tasted freedom in her surrender. She had collapsed under the weight of her own deceit, and now I would decide if she deserved mercy. I stood and moved toward the window, watching her reflected in the dark glass. Outside, the pines swayed in the mountain wind, indifferent witnesses to our collapse. I knew she would stay here through the night, haunted by every proof I'd unearthed. But dawn would bring a reckoning. I would ask her to explain every line, every hidden message, until truth was the only thing she knew how to speak. I turned back to her, the air thick with unsaid promises. This confession had stripped us both bare, but the story was far from over. The next step would require her voice, her admission, her final surrender. And when she spoke, the mountain would echo with the sound of her undoing. From the moment she sank beneath the weight of her own confessions, I moved with purpose. I told her that tonight I would need her to speak, to lay out every detail of the betrayal until no fragment remained hidden. I watched as she pressed her palms into the rug, her voice already hoarse from crying. She nodded once, small and broken, and I told her to follow me. We climbed the narrow stairs, light from a flickering lamp guiding us into the loft space. I gestured to the wooden crossbeam overhead and pulled down a length of rope I'd stashed earlier. Her eyes widened, but she didn't speak. My jaw clenched, I held back any sign of hesitation. I pressed the rope into her hands, and she gripped it as if it might burn her. Tie your own confession here, I said. Every lie you told me, every truth you withheld. Speak them aloud while you bind your hands. Her hands shook violently. She swallowed hard, lips quivering. Under the beam, she wrapped the coarse fibers around her wrists and paused, looking up at me as though seeking release. I don't understand, she whispered. What are you? I cut her off softly. You betrayed me, Sarah. You owe me the truth. Her shoulders trembled, and she began to murmur, I lied to you about him. I met him in the spring, Anne. Her voice cracked. She paused, tears rolling down her cheeks onto her chin. I expected her to stall, to cling to silence, but she began to speak. In jagged fragments, she described stolen afternoons, whispered confessions in borrowed embraces, secrets wrapped around lies. Every time she revealed a new detail, I tightened the grip on her emotions. When she faltered, I asked questions that cut deeper. Did you love him? Why not tell me? Each question was a scalpel, slicing away her defenses until she was raw and exposed. Her binding grew tighter as she confessed. Rope bit into her flesh, and she gasped, but she didn't stop. He made me feel alive, she cried. I was afraid to lose you, so I kept it hidden. Pain and guilt echoed in her voice. My own chest constricted with a mixture of triumph and sorrow. Part of me ached at her confession, but I watched her bind herself, marking each lie with a loop of rope. When the last truth emerged, when she admitted the final deception, I nodded. That's all, I said. My voice was calm, almost gentle. Now, untie yourself. She hesitated. Why? She choked. Because you have to live with the consequences, I answered, locking my gaze on hers. She bit her lip and began to pull at the knots, her fingers raw and trembling. The rope resisted before it loosened, and as it fell away, I saw the red marks on her skin. I let her stand for a moment, free but changed. She looked at me, her face pale and haunted, shadows of shame in her eyes. I stepped closer, placing a hand on her shoulder. You know I could have forced this, I whispered. But the truth you speak with your own will is the only justice. She nodded, tears brimming once more, and I led her down the stairs to the cabin center. I had laid out a table of objects, her journal, that secret letter, my recordings. Now I placed between them a single envelope addressed to her. Inside are messages you never sent, I told her. Words you wrote in anger, in fear, things that needed to be said. Her breath hitched. I watched as she opened it, unfolding each sheet. I saw her hands tremble as she read my words, my own confession of pain, of betrayal, of love twisted into vengeance. The firelight flickered across her face, illuminating every expression. She paused at one note, reading aloud, voice a whisper, I loved you so deeply that I became someone I barely recognize. Her eyes met mine, and in that moment it all shifted, the hunter and the hunted, the betrayer and the betrayed. Our roles melted together, bound by the tangled rope of our shared history. I stepped back, letting her absorb each confession. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, a reminder that the mountain itself was watching. She folded the letters, tears streaming, and handed them to me. Now, I said, you've given me my revenge. She looked up, her gaze a mixture of relief and devastation. Is it enough? I asked quietly. She nodded once, and the silence settled around us like snow. In the hush, I realized that vengeance rarely ends with satisfaction. The rope binding truth had freed her and me in different ways. And as the night deepened, I understood that this mountain retreat held our final reckoning, a union of pain and release, where betrayal and revenge merged into something neither of us could have predicted. That dawn, we sat at opposite ends of the table, the ashes of the fire cold between us. Sarah's eyes were red-rimmed, and her fingers traced idle patterns on the worn wood as if seeking the shape of her mistakes. I poured coffee into her chipped mug and watched as she lifted it with trembling hands, only to set it down again untouched. Across from her, I folded the letters and placed them back into the envelope, sealing them with deliberate care. In that silence, I felt an ache I couldn't name, an echo of regret mixed with something far darker. We understood each other without words. The game was far from over. Over the next hours, I orchestrated subtle tremors in her reality. I left flickering candles in unexpected corners, their shadows dancing like silent watchers on the walls. I shifted her personal items, her favorite scarf draped on a chair she didn't remember placing it on, a pair of gloves thawing in the sun though no one had worn them. Each small oddity built a tapestry of doubt around her, and every time she paused, caught between recognition and confusion, I felt the tide of power swell in my chest. This precise unraveling was my masterpiece, a slow pull of the rug that would leave her clinging to every splinter. By mid-afternoon, the strain began to show. Sarah's shoulders hunched as though bearing invisible weights, and her eyes darted at every creak of the floorboards. She muttered half-formed apologies under her breath, pauses thick with fear, while her hands fluttered like startled birds whenever I entered the room. Once, I watched her freeze, phone in hand, staring at a message notification that vanished before she could open it. I let her stand there, pinned by uncertainty, before offering a gentle invitation to tell me who she had texted. She stammered, voice fractured, unable to form the words that might acknowledge the ghost she feared haunted her. As evening fell, I introduced the sting of isolation. I left the cabin door slightly ajar, ensuring the mountain breeze carried hollow whispers and the distant howl of wolves. Inside, I dimmed the lights to a flicker, so that every shadow felt alive, creeping along the walls like silent conspirators. When she crept to the threshold, I pressed my back to the solid wood and let her see nothing behind me, only the darkness pointing her inward. She leaned against me, breath hot on my neck, and I whispered that help might never come. I watched her shoulders shake with sobs that weren't quite real, choreographed by the fear I had woven. In the quiet that followed, she began to speak truths I hadn't dared to ask. Her voice cracked as she admitted the depth of her remorse, how every unspoken fear had grown into an avalanche of deceit. Tears traced cold rivers down her cheeks, and she pressed her palms to her face, her nails digging into her skin. I could feel my own pulse pounding, ribs expanding and contracting like a drumbeat. As she spoke of guilt and regret, I realized the revenge had become something more, a mirror reflecting both our broken reflections. I let her confession unfold, knowing that in her bearing of the soul, I would find my final liberation. As the long night pressed on, I guided her back to the hearth. I collected the scattered pieces of paper, journal scraps, confessional letters, and voice recordings, and buried them in the dying embers, watching them curl into ash. Sarah knelt beside me, her breathing shallow, and I could feel the tremor in her spine as the flames consumed her secrets. When the last flicker died, I whispered that sometimes true closure arises only from destruction. She exhaled slowly, a ragged sound that seemed to release her from the prison of deceit. In that moment, when the mountain's silence wrapped around us, I understood that our story had irrevocably changed course, and that the next chapter would demand a reckoning neither of us could ignore. I woke to the scent of cold air slipping through a crack in the window frame, carrying a whisper of frost from the pines. Sarah was already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, back rigid, eyes fixed on the wall as if waiting for it to speak. The aftermath of last night's ritual hung between us like a shroud. I slid from under the covers, careful not to wake her, and crossed the room to draw the curtains just enough to let a pale light spill in. The cabin felt suspended in that gray dawn, as though the world outside held its breath for what we would do next. She didn't look at me when I returned with 2 mugs of steaming tea. Instead, she traced patterns in the wood floor, lips parted slightly, as if each breath pounded through her ribs. I handed her a mug, her fingers closed around it, trembling, but she didn't raise it to her lips. I sat across, balancing my cup on my knee, and let the silence stretch. The air tasted of cedar and ash, the remnants of burned confessions, and I realized that for the first time, we both seemed more lost than ever. After what felt like hours, she spoke in a voice so low I almost missed it. "Will you ever forgive me?" The question landed like a stone in my gut. Her eyes flicked up then, meeting mine with a vulnerability I'd never allowed myself to see before. She looked smaller somehow, as though the weight of her guilt had carved her down. I swallowed, feeling the ache behind my sternum. Truth and vengeance had consumed us equally, and now we stood at the edge of something neither of us could name. I brought my mug to my lips and held it there, letting the warmth seep in before I answered. "Forgive you?" I echoed softly. "I don't know if that's what I want." I set the cup down, noticing how her shoulders hunched at my words. "But I want you to understand what you did, to face the emptiness left by your secrets." My voice softened. And I need to know if you can live with that emptiness. Her chest rose and fell rapidly. She pressed the mug to her lips and finally drank, steam curling around her face. The tea slid down her throat, and she closed her eyes, as though bracing herself. I stood and walked to the window, looking out over the mist-laced pines. There's something else, I said without turning. Something I haven't shown you. She shifted beside me, her tea clinked against the wood. I reached into my pocket and produced a small, leather-bound notebook, another of her hidden journals, the one she'd used before I arrived. I placed it on the sill, letting the first light glint off its worn cover. You kept this long before our trip, I said. Pages of plans, dreams you never shared. I read them last night. Her breath caught, and she leaned forward, eyes fixed on the book. My words hung between us, dreams deferred, desires unspoken. She traced the stitching at the spine with a finger as if trying to reclaim fragments of herself. When she looked up, her gaze was fierce with something like defiance. You shouldn't have read it, she whispered. They were private. I met her stare. No more secrets, I replied. We've burned the old ones. Now we face what remains. Her lip quivered. I don't know who I am without them. The confession cracked her voice. I moved beside her and placed a hand on her shoulder. Maybe that's what I've been waiting for, the real you, stripped of lies. Her eyes glistened, and she leaned into my touch, trembling. That afternoon, we walked the trail that led beyond the cabin, each step stirring memories in the fallen needles. The mountain air bit at our cheeks, and the silence settled around us like a witness. I carried the notebook against my chest, she held the recorder at her side, a token of the past. We reached a clearing where the trees arched like a cathedral. I set the journal and recorder on a flat rock and turned to her. If you want forgiveness, I said, you have to speak again, this time not out of fear, but from here. I pressed a hand to my heart. Speak your own truth for yourself, not because you're bound by rope or guilt. Her breath trembled, and she opened the notebook with shaking fingers. Sunlight danced across the pages, illuminating her own words. She began to read, voice growing steadier with each line, dreams of leaving everything behind, of carving her own path. As she spoke, her shoulders straightened, and the tremor in her voice softened into resolve. I listened, the wind echoing her words among the pines, until the last page turned. When she closed the book, she looked at me with a clarity I hadn't seen since our arrival. I'm ready, she said quietly. For whatever comes next. The mountains seemed to inhale around us, waiting. And in that charged hush, I realized the true reckoning was only just beginning. From the moment she declared she was ready, an electric hush settled between us. I closed the notebook and recorder in my hand, then slid them into a small chest by the hearth. The firelight danced along the walls, as though marking territory between the past and what lay ahead. I motioned for her to take a seat at the table where surviving embers still glowed. She perched on the edge of the bench, eyes darting to where the chest sat like a promise unspoken. My pulse thrummed against my ribs as I reached for her hand, noting the way her fingers curled around mine with tentative hope. I want us to build something here, I said, voice low. Not on lies or confessions, but on moments we face together. A tremor passed through her frame, visible in the rhythm of her breath. She nodded, that same mixture of resolve and fear flitting across her features. My own stomach tightened with the weight of possibility and uncertainty. I stood and retrieved 2 slender wooden blocks from a shelf, a puzzle I had assembled before her arrival. Each piece fit snugly into another, though the pattern was intentionally incomplete. I handed her one block and placed the other on the table. We'll do this together, I explained. You tell me how to fit your piece into mine. But you can't look at what I'm doing. She blinked, hesitation rippling as she realized the blindfold I held out. I offered it gently. Trust me, I whispered. Her hand shook as she accepted the blindfold, cotton brushing her eyelashes. Darkness engulfed her vision, her breath catching as though the world had swallowed its air. I felt the chill of her skin through the wood as she gripped the block. Guide me, I urged. tell me where to place your piece. Her voice was soft and uncertain. Move forward a bit, lower, now tilt it. I shifted mine accordingly, listening as her directions wove into careful instructions. Outside, wind rattled the shutters, punctuating our murmur like an impatient conductor. At times her voice faltered, uncertainty stinging her tone, hesitation born of fear and the weight of the past. But each time she corrected me with new guidance, her confidence grew. I sensed her shoulders straighten under the blindfold, her breathing slowly steadying. When the final piece aligned with a satisfying click, she inhaled sharply. I removed the blindfold and met her eyes. The puzzle remained half complete, a jagged void reminding us of what was still missing. Yet between us, a fragile spark flickered, a sense that collaboration, not confrontation, might light the path forward. She exhaled, lips parting in a tremulous smile. That wasn't as terrifying as I thought, she whispered, voice thin. My chest ached at the vulnerability there, the aftershock of trust forged in darkness. I reached across the table and closed the gap between us, leaving a hand on her shoulder. Her pulse fluttered under my palm. I need to know what you fear most about moving forward, I said, tone gentle. Lay it bare. She swallowed, jaw working as she gathered her courage. I'm afraid that even if I try to be honest, I'll fail you again, she confessed, eyes glistening. That I'll betray you because I can't forgive myself. My heart constricted, torn between compassion and the echo of old wounds. I squeezed her hand. Then let this be the moment you forgive yourself, I murmured. Her shoulders sagged as tears traced silent paths down her cheeks. I reached for a cloth and brushed them away, noting the grit of ash mingling with her sorrow. The fire sputtered low, casting shadows that stretched toward us like cautious allies. In that charged hush, a new resolve took shape. We grasped the puzzle blocks together, pieces clicking into place until the pattern looked whole, imperfect edges and all. With each join, her hands steadied, her gaze locking with mine. When the last piece fell, I laid my palm over hers. We built this, I said, voice thick. A start. She nodded, lips pressed into a line between hope and fear. We rose as one, stepping away from the table into the open space of the cabin. The puzzle sat between us, a testament to fragile reconstruction. In the distance, the wind sighed through the pines, as though offering its quiet blessing. And as we stood there, side by side, I understood that revenge had evolved into something neither of us expected, a chance at renewal forged from the shards of betrayal. The morning light filtered through the pines, casting pale stripes across the cabin floor, and we awoke side by side on the rug where we had knelt the night before. Neither of us spoke as I stretched out, feeling the ache in my shoulders from yesterday's revelations. Sarah sat up slowly, brushing ash from her hair, and for a moment our eyes met. In that gray dawn, there was a fragile peace between us. But peace, I'd learned, was just the eye of the storm. I rose and padded to the hearth, where the puzzle lay complete and silent. Its imperfect seams reminded me that healing was never seamless. I poured water into the kettle, its hiss filling the hush, and carried 2 mugs back to our spot on the rug. She accepted one with a small nod, wrapping her fingers around its warmth. Outside, the wind whispered through the needles, a lullaby or a warning, I wasn't sure which. After a long sip, she looked at me, chin trembling. I don't know what to do next, she said quietly. Her voice bore the weight of someone stranded on a new shore, dazzled by open space yet terrified of its emptiness. My chest tightened. We take the next step, I answered, voice low. We apply honesty to everything, even the smallest corners. She nodded, but I saw the flicker of doubt in her eyes, the old habit of hiding behind half-truths. I stood and moved toward the bookshelf, running my fingers over the worn spines until I found the small envelope I'd left tucked behind our journals the night before. Without a word, I handed it to her. Inside was a folded receipt, nothing more than a faded slip from a roadside pharmacy, dated weeks before our anniversary trip. I watched her hands shake as she unfolded it. It listed 2 items, cough syrup and a box of pills she never mentioned. Her breath hitched, and she looked up with wide, haunted eyes. I forgot to tell you, she stammered, cheeks flushing. Her knuckles whitened around the paper. I swallowed as I realized I'd uncovered a fragment of her hidden life, an illness she'd concealed, maybe fearing pity or burdening me. Why didn't you say anything? I asked softly, though the question felt heavy in the space between us. She pressed the receipt to her chest, gaze slipping away. I was scared, she confessed, voice breaking. I didn't want you to see me as weak. Her shoulders hunched, and she rocked slightly, as though her own body had become unfamiliar territory. I stood there, mug warming my palm, torn between vindication and concern. The strands of my revenge trembled at the revelation, like threads in a web shaken by wind. I knelt beside her and placed a hand on her back, feeling the tremble of her spine. You don't have to hide from me, I murmured. Her head bowed, lips pressed together. Then, slowly, she handed me the receipt and lifted her chin. I'm sorry for keeping that from you, she whispered. The apology landed with genuine tremor, not rehearsed remorse. My heart thudded in my throat. I realized that beneath her betrayal lay a fear I hadn't accounted for. Outside, the cabin door creaked as the wind pushed against it. Sarah looked toward the shadows at the entrance, then back at me. There's more, she said, voice barely audible. I've been seeing someone, my doctor. He said I might need treatment. Her words trailed off. I felt a hollow twist in my gut. This was no affair but a secret born of vulnerability. The lines between sin and survival blurred. I rose unsteadily, setting my mug aside. The steam curled upward, dispersing into the still air. I reached for her hand but hesitated, my fingers hovering above hers. She watched, waiting for a touch that might bridge the widening gap of unspoken fears. Finally, I interlaced our fingers, feeling her pulse flutter against my palm. Thank you for telling me, I said, voice raw. Her frame sagged with relief and shame combined. In that charged moment, the scale tipped. My carefully constructed revenge had collided with a truth she hid out of weakness, not malice. I sensed a new path unfolding, one that demanded compassion as fiercely as retribution. Outside, the wind sighed through the pines, as though urging me to decide whether to uproot her entirely or to let the tangled roots of our shared history hold fast. We remained kneeling by the hearth, hands clasped, listening to the cabin's silent verdict. And as the shadows lengthened, I realized the true test was only beginning, whether forgiveness could stand where betrayal had carved its mark, and whether love could grow again among those scars. The mountain waited, patient and knowing, for my answer. The morning air felt heavy as she and I knelt by the hearth, heat fading, heartbeats loud in the hush. Our fingers still intertwined, I watched her chest rise and fall, the faint tremor of fear mingled with hope. I drew in a long breath, tasting cedar and ash, and whispered that I was ready to decide. Her gaze lifted, wide, expectant, as though she awaited a verdict carved into silence. I stood and wiped my hands on my jeans, the fabric rough against my skin. My jaw ached from relearning how to hold softness and steel together. Yet my next words came softly, let's go to the ridge where we first met. A flicker of surprise passed over her face, replaced by a tentative smile. She nodded, settled into a chair, and I fetched our coats. We stepped outside, the pine needles muffling our footsteps. The path wound upward, each bend familiar and strange, carrying echoes of laughter we once shared without shadow. Sarah's breath plumed in the cold, and I heard the quick intake as she realized how high we climbed. My pulse quickened, part of me soared with possibility, another part tightened with the dread of what I might find. At the summit, we paused on the edge of the ridge, wind whipping our hair. Below, the valley spread like a silent promise. I reached into my pocket and handed her a folded scrap of paper, a receipt, this one from a local inn, time-stamped after the confession. She unfolded it, eyes scanning the lines, and her face drained of color. Her knuckles whitened around the paper. I asked, "What's this?" my voice rough. She shook her head, tears shimmering in her eyes. It's nothing. I went alone. Her words tumbled out, she'd escaped one night to clear her head, to sort the wreckage of our unraveling without me watching. I felt betrayal flicker again, ember stoked by the wind. My fingers curled around the edge of the ridge's stone rail, knuckles whitening. The memory of her confession by the crossbeam, the raw trust she'd earned back, clashed in my mind with this secret trip. My voice caught, "You lied about that too." She shook her head, voice trembling. I needed space. I thought without secrets I could breathe. Her gaze fell, shame dragging her shoulders down. My chest pounded, the air tasted metallic. I had been ready to heal, to rebuild, but that trip felt like a crack in our fragile bridge. I searched her face for truth, her cheeks stained, lashes dusted with tears. I realized then that trust had to be more than forgiveness, it demanded constant honesty. My heart clenched with sadness. "I'm not safe enough," I said, the words jagged. Shame burned in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered, stepping closer with arms outstretched. I stood still, wind tugging at my hair. In that moment, I saw her fully, flawed and fear-racked, reaching for comfort. My own hands trembled, one on the rail, one at my side. I closed my eyes against the gale, a war inside me between release and retribution. When I opened them, I turned my back to the valley. I need proof, not promises. The conviction in my voice surprised me. She blinked, hurt and understanding mingling in her gaze. "Tell me how to earn that proof," she pleaded, voice breaking. My throat tightened, desire for her forgiveness warred with dread of another betrayal. I inhaled the crisp air and held her gaze. "Stay with me here," I said. "Until I decide if we can climb back from this." The ridge felt vast, empty now, like the space between us. She nodded, shoulders quivering, and joined me by the rail. We stood side by side, distant from the valley, bound by an unspoken pact. She would wait and be transparent, and I would watch. As the wind snatched at our coats, I realized the mountain offered no easy answers. The path forward would demand endurance, vigilance, and maybe, ultimate sacrifice. Sarah leaned against me, warmth soft against my elbow, and I let her for a moment. Then I closed my eyes against the gale, tasting cedar and regret, and braced for whatever choice lay ahead, redemption or irrevocable loss. We lingered on the ridge long after the sun dipped below the pines, the sky shifting from lavender to ink. Sarah pressed close, the weight of her breath warm against my sleeve, even as the wind bit through our jackets. Below us, the valley was swallowed by darkness, and only the distant glow of the cabin's lone window offered any sense of direction. I kept my gaze fixed on the horizon, as if the fading light might somehow guide my next decision. "I'm cold," she whispered, voice hoarse, but she didn't move away. I nodded and slipped off my pack, wrapping it around her shoulders. The wool was worn and smelled faintly of cedar, a reminder of every step we'd climbed together. She shivered, tucking her chin into the blanket, and I felt a pang of regret at how far we'd strayed. This night, this moment, could mark our undoing or our rebirth. After a long silence, I turned to her. "Tell me something true," I said, voice softer than I expected. "Not because I demanded it, but because you chose to share it." Her eyes glistened in the dim light. She hesitated, then inhaled sharply. "I lied about the trip here, too," she confessed. "I thought I could heal on my own, that I didn't deserve your forgiveness." Her words fell between us, fragile and trembling. I inhaled the cold air, tasting honesty. "Why tell me now?" I asked. Her gaze dropped to the valley below. "Because I realized that if I wanted to stay, with you, with us, I had to stop running." Her hand found mine under the blanket. Her fingers curled around mine, warm and tentative. The electricity of that small touch reminded me how much power lay in simple truths. I nodded slowly, weighing her confession against every deception that had come before. The valley seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for me to speak judgment. My chest tightened, not with anger this time, but with fear of losing what remained. Finally, I exhaled and unclenched my fists. "Thank you," I said quietly, and the word felt heavy and real. She blinked, relief and uncertainty crossing her face. "Is that enough?" she asked, voice cracking. I hesitated. Was gratitude enough to build us back from this height? The wind whipped at my hair, and I realized that standing here, I was no longer sure what path to choose. The mountain didn't offer mercy or condemnation, it only watched. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I want to try." The admission felt like stepping off a ledge, unsteady but inevitable. She exhaled, a sound of release, and leaned her head against my shoulder. We watched the stars ignite above us, pinpricks of light in the vast sky, and in that fragile tableau, I felt the shift. Revenge had given way to something far more precarious, hope. We stayed until the chill drove us back to the cabin, moving slowly as if retracing each step might unravel us again. Inside, the hearth was cold, embers were only faint pinpoints of red. I gathered fresh wood and coaxed a spark to life, the flame dancing shadows across Sarah's face. She sat on the hearth's edge, knees drawn to her chest, and I knelt beside her, offering a mug of hot tea. She accepted it with a grateful sigh. In the firelight, I saw the lines of guilt still etched on her forehead, but also a new light, tentative, flickering, like the flame itself. I realized that forgiveness wouldn't come all at once. It would be earned in countless small moments, shared silence, unguarded laughter, a hand held in darkness. I placed my palm over hers, feeling her pulse settle beneath my fingers. "Tomorrow," I said, voice low, "we start fresh. No secrets." She lifted her gaze, the fire reflecting in her eyes. "No secrets," she echoed. Outside, the mountain wind sighed through the pines, as if granting its blessing. In that hush, we sat together, two flawed souls bound by truth at last, ready to face whatever came next. The valley lay between us and the unknown, but for the first time since our crossing, it felt less like a chasm and more like a promise. The next morning, the sky was pale when I crossed the threshold of our cabin. Sarah sat by the window, her shoulders relaxed for the first time, and she offered me a small, tentative smile. We hadn't spoken a word since the night before. Instead, our silence felt like a promise we were both learning to keep. I poured fresh water into the kettle and watched her trace the condensation on the glass with a fingertip. Coffee brewed soon and its aroma mingled with the scent of pine drifting through the cracked window. I brought 2 mugs to the table. Sarah accepted hers with a nod, lifting it in both hands as though it might slip through her fingers. I sat opposite and let the warmth rise through my palms before I spoke. "I thought we might fetch water from the stream today," I said. "It feels right, to do something simple together." She met my gaze, relief softening her eyes. "I'd like that," she whispered. We finished our drinks and packed a small satchel with jars and towels. Outside, the air was cool as we stepped onto the wooden deck and breathed the mountain morning. The path to the stream wound through pines and ferns, the needle-strewn earth giving under our boots with a soft hush. We walked side by side without speaking, listening to the rustle of leaves and the distant murmur of water. At the clearing, the stream curved around mossy stones, water gleaming silver. I set down the jars and reached for a towel. Sarah knelt and dipped her hands into the flow, lifting water to her lips and then to the jars, careful and deliberate. I knelt beside her and watched the ripples spread around our reflections. "Thank you for coming with me," I said softly. She paused, water dripping from her hair. "I feel like each step with you counts," she answered. "I'm afraid of losing you again." Her voice trembled as she spoke into the emptiness. I turned the jar toward her and caught her eye. "Show me how you feel safe," I urged. She swallowed and reached into her pocket, pulling out a small pill bottle. "I carry these," she murmured. "I need them sometimes, and I feared you'd leave if you knew." The label was worn, the last prescription date smudged. I took the bottle gently and examined it. "Thank you," I said. "Honesty like this matters more than anything." I stood and offered her my hand. She rose, and I guided her back to the jar collection. Then I tied a length of ribbon around the bottle and clipped it to a hook near the door. "You won't have to hide again," I promised as I pressed the ribbon tight. After filling our jars, we sat on a fallen log, sipping cold stream water. Sunlight filtered through the canopy and danced on the surface. She leaned against me, warmth seeping through her sleeve. We stayed until the sun climbed high and our jars were full. Then we returned to the cabin, footsteps lighter and steps shared. Back inside, I boiled the water for tea and placed the jars on the counter. Sarah moved about the kitchen to prepare something simple, a handful of berries, bread toasted. We worked together, moving around each other with an ease born of growing trust. She glanced over at me, cheeks flushed, and for the first time, I saw relief mingled with determination in her eyes. When we sat down again, Sarah reached across the table and touched my palm. "I want to keep doing this," she said. "One day at a time." I nodded and squeezed her hand. The mountain outside shimmered with heat, but inside, we had built something sturdier than anything we had known. Our journey was far from over, but in that quiet morning light, we had found a simple truth: honesty could be the water that healed us both. That afternoon, we set out again, shoulders lighter but hearts still tender. The sun drifted through high pines, scattering diamond light across the mossy floor. We walked the narrow trail in silence, each footstep a promise that honesty could guide us. When we reached the old ravine bridge, a fallen pine trunk spanning a shallow gorge, Sarah hesitated, fingers brushing the rough bark. I paused beside her, noting the way her jaw clenched. "You don't have to cross if you're not ready," I offered softly. Her breath hitched. She bit her lip and looked down at the dark water below, swirling over smooth stones. "I trust you," she whispered, voice trembling. I nodded and took her hand, guiding her foot onto the trunk. Together we crept across, balance born of cautious steps and shared resolve. Halfway through, the pine groaned beneath our weight, and Sarah froze, body rigid. I pressed forward, keeping my voice steady. "Look at me." She lifted her eyes slowly, fear and determination mingling in her gaze. I held her hand tighter. "One step at a time, okay?" With a slow exhale, she put one foot before the other until we reached the far bank safely. Relief washed over her face in a flush of pink. "Thank you," she said, voice small. I wrapped my arm around her waist, steady and warm. We found a fallen log near the gorge's edge and sat to rest. I reached into my pocket for the journal she had handed back earlier and offered it to her. "Add something," I said, "about today, what you felt." She took the pen and wrote in careful loops. I learned that trust can carry me across my own fears. Then she closed it and handed it back with a shaky smile. I kept it tucked against my heart, savoring the fresh ink of her truth. As we turned to begin the return, her phone buzzed. She jumped, knocking the journal from her lap. I retrieved it, but Sarah's face shifted, panic flared in her eyes. She grabbed the phone as if it burned her and hid it behind her back. "It's nothing," she lied, voice tight. I studied her expression in the dappled light. Secrets died by confession, not by concealment. I held the journal out to her and said, "Show me." She looked at me, tears pooling. Finally, she pressed the screen and revealed a message preview: "Meet me tonight." My chest tightened. The blood pounded in my ears. She dropped her gaze. "It's just an old friend," she stammered. "Someone from before." I swallowed the hurt that rose like bitter bile. "Do I get to know his name?" I asked quietly. Her lips parted, closed, and after a moment she whispered, "Daniel." My heart fluttered. Daniel was the stranger whose messages had first shattered us. I closed my eyes and took a steady breath. The gorge below whispered in its shallow roar. "Tell me why he wants to meet," I said. Her shoulders sagged as though weighted by guilt. She inhaled sharply and began, He's been reaching out, worried about me. He's my doctor's assistant. He thinks my meds need adjusting." Her voice cracked on the last words. My head reeled. This was no affair but a medical check. Relief and shame fought inside her gaze. My hand found hers. "I'm sorry for jumping," I admitted, chest tight. She squeezed back, tears tracing tracks in the dirt. I should have told you. In the hush, truth settled between us like soft earth over ashes. I nodded. No more hiding. She leaned against me, and we rose together, closing the distance back across the fallen pine, united by fresh resolve and the knowledge that trust, once fractured, still had room to grow. Back on solid ground, we moved in careful silence, our steps soft on the needle-strewn earth. The sun dipped low behind the pines, spilling golden light through the branches and painting the path in hues of amber. I slipped my arm around Sarah's shoulders, and she leaned into me, warmth moving between us like a fragile promise. The bridge behind us felt like a threshold we'd already crossed together, one of many to come. We reached the clearing where we'd first collected stream water. I knelt to inspect the ribbon still tied around her pill bottle hook near the path's edge. The ribbon fluttered in the breeze, bright against the moss. Sarah crouched beside me and traced the fibers with a fingertip, her eyes reflecting the dying light. "Thank you for trusting me," she whispered. I offered a small smile. "You earned it today." As twilight settled, our breaths rose in pale plumes. I glanced at the cabin windows ahead, lamps glowing like lanterns beckoning us home. "Let's prepare dinner," I suggested. She nodded, cheeks flushed by cold and relief. Inside, I gathered onions, garlic, and root vegetables from the pantry while she lit candles on the windowsill. Flames danced in her eyes as she arranged them, and I caught a glimpse of hope there, soft, vulnerable, but unmistakable. We worked side by side, chopping and stirring under the low light. Sarah hummed a simple tune, quiet but steady, as she sliced carrots into rounds. The rhythmic thud against the cutting board reminded me of her heartbeat against mine. I tossed onions into sizzling oil, the aroma weaving into the cabin's warm air. "I'm sorry for every time I hid things," she said, voice low. Steam curled from the pan, and I watched her reflection shimmer in the polished surface. "I know honesty isn't easy, but," she paused, searching for words. I slid a wooden spoon across the counter and reached for her hand. "You don't have to explain. Just keep sharing." She exhaled, nodding. "When I met you here, I was terrified. Ached for your forgiveness. I carried fear in my chest like a stone." Her fingers squeezed mine, and I felt the weight of her confession settle between us. "Tonight, I want to share something else," she continued. "Something I never showed anyone." I set down a ladle and turned to face her. "Whatever it is, I'm here." Her gaze dropped, then lifted with resolve. She stepped toward the bookshelf and retrieved a thin, leather-bound diary, one I hadn't noticed before. "This was my journal long ago, before you arrived," she said. "I wrote about dreams and fears I couldn't tell my parents." She opened to a page where the ink had faded to sepia. "I was 14, she read, voice trembling, "and I was afraid I'd never be enough." Her words hung in the air, raw and exposed. I reached out and brushed the page with a fingertip. The handwriting wavered, loops tight with youthful uncertainty. "You were enough then," I said softly. She met my gaze, tears glistening in candlelight. "Not when I felt I had to lie to survive." She closed the diary and pressed it to her chest. "But now, I want to trust enough to face my past." The stove's oven timer chimed, a gentle reminder. I gathered 2 plates of roasted vegetables and placed them on the table. The room filled with warmth and the scent of thyme. Sarah sat across from me, her posture open. We ate in companionable silence, the crackle of candle flames the only soundtrack. With each bite, I sensed a rebuilding of something fragile and new. When we finished, she rose and carried the empty plates to the sink. I followed, drying each one before stacking. Our movements synchronized, an unspoken dance that spoke of growing familiarity. At the last plate, she paused and turned to me. "I believe we can heal here," she said, voice steady. I nodded, heart thudding. One day at a time. Outside, the pines whispered in the night breeze, and the cabin seemed to exhale. We stood together in the quiet kitchen, hands brushing as we reached for a clean towel. In that simple touch, I felt the tether of our trust strengthen. Ahead lay more steps, more confessions, more revelations, more crossings of ravines and ridges. But for now, the space between us felt smaller, bridged by honesty and shared moments. As we blew out the candles and closed the shutters against the dark, I knew our story was far from over. The path we walked remained uncertain, but we walked it together, two flawed souls bound by the vow to move forward in truth. And in that promise, I found a fragile peace more potent than any revenge I could have wrought. I woke to the rumble of distant thunder shaking the cabin's timbers, and when I opened my eyes, Sarah was already awake, sitting on the windowsill and watching gray clouds boil over the pines. Her shoulders were drawn up around her ears, and her fingers tapped the cold glass in a restless rhythm. I slipped out of bed and crossed the room quietly, pressing my palm to her back. She didn't startle. Instead, she leaned into me, as though she needed the weight of another heart beside her to keep her rooted. "I've never seen a storm like this here," she murmured, voice tight. I nodded, tracing the curve of her neck with my thumb. "It's been calm for weeks. I think the mountain's testing us." The wind shrieked against the shutters, and I felt the echo in my own chest. For a moment, all the work we'd done, the confessions, the shared steps, the puzzle pieces bridged under blindfold, hovered between us like fragile glass. One wrong move and it could shatter. After a moment, she slipped from the sill and stood facing me. Wet hair clung to her forehead, her eyes were luminous with unshed fears. "I'm not ready to lose you," she said, voice breaking. "Not after everything." I swallowed the lump in my throat and cupped her face. "You won't," I promised, though my heart trembled at the weight of the vow. We faced this storm together. We moved through the cabin gathering what we might need: a thick blanket, extra candles, water in glass bottles. Sarah paused at the door to the loft and glanced upward. "I'm still afraid of that rope," she whispered. I gently took her hand. "We burned it for a reason. You don't need that anymore." Relief flickered in her eyes, and she squeezed my fingers before closing the ladder hatch firmly. Downstairs, the first flash of lightning illuminated the living room in a stark white, followed by a crack so close the windows rattled. Sarah jumped, and I wrapped the blanket around her. "You're safe," I said, voice low. "I'm here." She buried her face against my chest, and I held her, listening to the storm's fury. When the wind died to a howl and the lights blinked out, I lit candles along the mantel. Their flickering glow made our shadows dance across the walls, giant and small. I guided Sarah to the rug by the hearth and sat beside her. "Tell me what you feel," I urged softly. She drew a shaky breath. "My heart is pounding so loud I can't hear anything else." She bit her lip and closed her eyes. "I keep waiting for the next betrayal, like the storm will reveal something else you can't forgive." My chest tightened. I realized that despite all her truths, she still believed love was conditional on perfection. "Come closer," I whispered. She curled into my side, and I wrapped an arm around her. "I forgive you for being afraid," I said. "I forgive you for every secret that fear led you to keep. And I need you to forgive yourself." Her breath hitched, and for a moment, I thought tears would spill. Instead, she nodded against my shoulder, as though drawing strength from that forgiveness as much as from the blanket. Thunder rumbled again, more distant this time, and I stood, brushing ash from my jeans. "Stay here," I said. "I'll check the shutters." Sarah watched me go, silhouetted in candlelight, her form small but steadfast. I moved through the cabin, tightening boards and wedging furniture against the windows. Each nail I hammered was like a promise I was making, to protect her, to protect what we'd rebuilt. When I returned, Sarah had lit another row of candles around the room, their warmth softening the shadows. She handed me a cup of tea she'd brewed in the kettle. The steam curled toward me, and I accepted it gratefully. We sipped in silence, perched on the rug, as the storm rolled past, its thunder fading into a distant drum. Finally, she spoke. I think I can trust us to weather anything." Her voice was small, but steady. I set my cup down and brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Yes," I said, conviction steady in my chest. We can. Outside, the clouds broke, and moonlight poured through the window in silver ribbons. In that glow, I saw relief etched across her features, and a new determination that matched my own. As the cabin settled into quiet again, I realized the true test had not been the storm itself, but what lay beneath: fear of imperfection, terror of loss. And in facing that, hand in hand, we had proven something more enduring than any revenge or betrayal. We had proven trust. The fall of night brought a hush that felt like surrender as we packed the last of our candles into the lantern and closed the cabin door. I paused in the threshold, tracing the smooth wood with my fingertips, and Sarah's gaze met mine with a steadiness shaped by everything we'd endured. We moved to the hearth one final time, where the embers of old grievances glowed faintly beneath the ashes. I set the lantern down, its light casting long shadows that merged our reflections on the worn floorboards. "This is it," I murmured, voice low, "the moment I've waited for." Sarah exhaled and nodded, the flicker of her candle revealing a resolve tempered by fear and hope. I knelt beside her, tracing the scarlet ribbons where her secrets once bound her wrists, and I said, "Revenge taught me the shape of your betrayal, but forgiveness teaches me the shape of your soul." The words hovered between us like a fragile truce. She closed her eyes and rested her head against my shoulder, melting into my warmth as the last echoes of anger drifted away. "I was wrong," she whispered, voice trembling like distant wind in the pines. "I carried shame so heavy, I thought I wasn't worthy of truth or love." I held her, breath steady beneath the falling night, and I answered, "You are worthy of both, and I am sorry I inflicted more pain in the name of justice." Her tears fell onto my palm, and each one felt like a promise dissolving the cold between us. We rose together, pressing palms and foreheads in a quiet ritual of closure, and stepped toward the window where moonlight bled across the pines. I opened the lantern and lifted it high, spilling golden light into the night and into our future. "Where to now?" Sarah asked, lips curving into a weary smile. I considered the valley below, the ridge beyond, and the countless paths carved by wind and wolves. "We walk forward," I said, voice steady, "together, in truth." She reached for my hand, fingers intertwining, and I felt the pulse of her life echo within mine. "Together," she repeated, and we stepped outside into the mountain air. The pines whispered overhead, a hymn of renewal that carried fallen leaves on a breeze scented of resin and rain. We crossed the threshold, bootprints following ancient tracks outlined in silver moonlight. At the edge of the clearing, I paused to look back, the cabin glowing like a heart in the forest's embrace. Sarah waited beside me, her silhouette steady against the trembling shadows. I took a breath that tasted of cedar and forgiveness, and led her down the path where unknown mornings would rise. With each step, the weight of the past grew lighter until even the memory of betrayal seemed like smoke on the breeze. When dawn arrives, it will find us walking, hands held, eyes open, and hearts released from the tangle of vengeance. This story ends in the quiet promise of new beginnings, of two souls who learned that love's true shape can only be carved by mercy.